The Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq remains one of the central issues in the U.S. presidential election campaign. Violence there continues to escalate, resulting in growing numbers of deaths and injuries among American soldiers and Iraqi civilians. Although recent presidential debates focused on differences between President Bush and his opponent Senator John Kerry on the rationale for the war, the two candidates agree on the need to prosecute the conflict until victory. Meanwhile, in Iraq, U.S. forces continue an offensive against insurgents in the city of Fallujah, where hostility to the American occupation has grown after weeks of constant airstrikes. In mid-October, 18 U.S. soldiers of the U.S. Army's 343rd Quartermaster Company made headlines when they refused to deliver a shipment of fuel from the Talil Air Base near Nasiriyah to a base in Taji in the north. The soldiers, who claimed their trucks were unsafe and did not have an adequate armed escort, are now under investigation for insubordination. The incident underscores long-standing charges that many American troops in Iraq are ill-equipped and have been placed in unnecessary danger by the Pentagon's poor war planning. In his latest book, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, MIT professor of linguistics and philosophy Noam Chomsky examines U.S. foreign policy and concludes that our government's aggressive military posture and disdain for international treaties and conventions on arms control, the environment, and human rights threaten the very survival of humankind. Between the lines, Scott Harris spoke with Professor Chomsky, America's most honored intellectual dissident, about his views on the primary motivation for the Iraq War and the choices before voters in the November 2nd U.S. presidential election.
After the collapse of the original pretexts, weapons of mass destruction, ties to terror, and so on, a new claim surfaced, namely what the liberal press calls Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq, the Middle East, the world, etc. And it's interesting that here in the United States, that declaration was taken very seriously. In fact, you have to search hard to find any commentator who doesn't accept that that was the goal. There are critics, but the critics typically say that it's a noble and inspiring vision, but it's beyond their reach. It's not realistic. Their cultures, the Iraqi culture, isn't ready for such dramatic improvements and so on. Right at the time that the president announced his messianic vision with enormous applause here, there was a poll published, actually in the Washington Post, taken in Baghdad by Western organizations, and they had asked people, why do you think the U.S. invaded Iraq? Well, about 1% said that the goal was to establish democracy. So 1% of Iraqis agree with roughly 100% of articulate opinion here, based solely on the president's declaration. There's no other evidence for it. The rest of the people polled, most of them said that the goal was to take control of Iraq's resources, to use control of Iraq in a dependent client state, to reorganize the region in U.S. interests, which makes perfect sense. If the U.S. conquers Iraq and imposes a dependent client state, which will be called a democracy, but, imperial powers quite commonly do that. They allow some degree of formal participation as long as the decisions are under control. That's what the U.S. has done for a century in its own domains locally, what the British did, and so on. So the goal would be to establish a dependent client state with democratic forms, but keeping strictly within constraints imposed by Washington, and following economic policies that it imposes and so on, and with permanent U.S. military bases, stable bases, right in the heart of the world's major oil-producing regions. And before the invasion, Russia and French companies had the inside track on developing them. Okay, that's over. Now it's U.S. companies, and so they get the profits. But crucially, the U.S. gets the control. It's not a matter of access to oil, but control over it. And you go back to the, by now, declassified documents of the 1940s, and the State Department was pointing out that control over Middle East oil resources is a what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the great material prizes of world history. Sure, it's been understood, still is. And the invasion, as Iraqis seem to understand, but we don't allow ourselves to think about, the invasion was intended to achieve that aim.
Professor Chomsky, I wondered if you talk about the differences, if any, you see between George W. Bush and Senator John Kerry on the Imperial grand strategy you've written a lot about. Just another question about the election, just to frame them together. As a former supporter of Ralph Nader in the 2000 election, you recently signed a letter urging progressive voters to support Kerry and Edwards in swing states. I guess, to sum it up, what do you believe is at stake in this presidential election?
Well, first of all, I should correct that common misimpression. I said exactly the same thing in the year 2000, precisely the same thing.
Regarding Ralph Nader?
Yeah. I said that it's important to ensure that Bush doesn't get elected, which means in swing states you have to vote for the only viable alternative, the Democratic candidate, and what you do in safe states has other factors enter. So I just repeated what I'd said then. I also repeated something which in my view is much more important, which is that there is a huge propaganda campaign to try to restrict political action to pushing a lever once every 4 years in a highly personalized extravaganza that's constructed by the public relations industry. We shouldn't submit to that. We should understand that what's important is to create a real democratic culture in which those choices all mean something, and that's a matter of day-to-day activity. With regard to the current choices, if you happen to be in a swing state and your vote happens to matter, you have to ask, are there significant differences between the two parties? And the answer is that there are. In the Imperial grand strategy, as foreign affairs call it, they happen to be different. The Clinton proposals are by no means as extreme and dangerous as the Bush proposals. And the same goes right across the board. So on domestic issues, the people around Bush are very openly committed to dismantling the achievements of popular struggle over the past century, which have created a certain degree of popularly supported social welfare programs, Social Security, Medicare, and others, a degree of progressive taxation and so on. They want to dismantle all of that to ensure that wealth and power are concentrated to an extent that hasn't been seen for a long time, if ever, concentrated in the hands of completely unaccountable private tyrannies. The people around Kerry, I don't like their policies, but they're nowhere near so extreme in this respect. But within the choices that come up on November 2nd, there happens to be a difference. And in my view, it should take about 10 minutes of our time to figure this out and then go on to the important issues.
That was Noam Chomsky, MIT professor of linguistics, author, and political analyst. His latest book is titled Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, published by Metropolitan. Read more about Professor Chomsky's work online at www.chomsky.info or www.zmag.org.